In the last lecture, I walked you through this component and how it generally is structured. Now let's dive deeper into this JSX thing. For this, I'll comment out this block here so that it's not used anymore, and I'll return something else. I can use the React object we're importing up here and call a method on it, create element. This, by the way, is also the reason why we have to import React, because this code here is in the end compiled to what we're writing here, even though we don't see that. Create element is a method and it takes 3 arguments. Actually, it takes an infinite amount of arguments, but at least 3. The first one is the element we want to render to the DOM. This could be a div. This can be a normal HTML element like a div. It could also be your own component if you have one available here. We don't though, because we're inside a component, we can't render that. We could render any other component we're importing, but we have no such component. The second argument is basically the configuration for this. And there we would pass a JavaScript object. This is optional. We can also pass null, and we'll do this for now because I don't want to configure it. The third argument here then is any amount of children. And we could have multiple arguments separated by commas. Children means what's nested inside this div. Now in this case, we want to nest the h1 element. Let's try by adding h1, and then as another argument, let's add this text here with multiple exclamation marks, and let's escape this quotation mark here with a backslash, so that we can identify that this was rendered by this create element method. Now with that, let me save this code, create element with 4 arguments, div, null, h1, and the text. Make sure you save the file. In Visual Studio Code, you see that it is saved if you see a cross here and no dot. And then let's go back to our application. Here we see h1, hi, I'm a React app. And if we inspect this in the developer tools, in Chrome here in my case, which I strongly recommend using, you see we got a div with 2 text nodes inside, h1 and hi, I'm a React app. So we didn't render a h1 element, we rendered text. And this is actually the default behavior. h1 here is interpreted as text. It's not rendered as an element. If we want to render another element inside the div, what we have to do is replace this code here with another call to React create element to create a new HTML element at the end. Here we now pass h1, then null as configuration, and then the text we want to render. So here, let's mix this up and say, does this work now? Now if we save this file and we go back to the application, we see a h1 tag, does this work now? And we can also see this if we inspect it in the developer tools. We get a div wrapping a h1 tag. Now what we don't see is the CSS styling getting applied because we don't see the class being added. In our JSX code, we added a CSS class with class name, not with class by the way. I'll come back to why we use class name in the next lecture. So we add class name. In our create element call, we would simply not pass null as configuration, but a JavaScript object. And there we can define class name and assign any CSS classes we want to add. For example, app, the same class we're applying here. If we now save this file again, it reloads, and we now see the updated styling with the centered text, and we see the CSS class being applied here on the div too. This is super important to understand. The code we just wrote here with React create element and the nested React create element is the exact equivalent of this JSX code. And it's actually to what this code here will get compiled by one of the many build tools we get out of the box in this project. It is the reason why we need to import React even though we're not using it at all when using this syntax, because behind the scenes we will use it once it is compiled. Of course, writing the code like this with create element is really cumbersome, especially as you add and nest more and more elements. This is why we typically don't use this code, but instead this code we started with. This is the reason why we use JSX, but it's super important to understand the internals and understand what this compiles to, and also, most important of all, understand that whilst it does look like HTML, it isn't. This is JavaScript in the end. It gets compiled to this code.